It's day 14 of our Advent readings, and our chapter is called God's New Address, and it begins with a verse from John 1 verse 14. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. One of my friends lives in Epsom in Surrey. In 2007, Chelsea Football Club officially opened new training facilities nearby. Since then, members of the team and staff have moved into the neighbourhood. As a result, local house prices have risen because the area has become a more desirable place to live in. Chelsea FC have added value to the neighbourhood. When the Word became flesh, Jesus moved into our neighbourhood. He made his dwelling among us. The word dwelling is literally tabernacled. Jesus, the Word, tabernacled among us. In Jesus, God pitched his tent among us. John is pointing us to the story of Israel in the desert after God had liberated them from slavery in Egypt. God told Moses to build a tent or a tabernacle in which God would live among his people. Constructing a tent for God might seem to us an odd thing to do. Perhaps we start thinking of a wedding marquee or a camping trip. But to the Israelites at that time, a tent meant only one thing: home. They lived in tents. And now God was moving into the neighbourhood. He was going to dwell among his people. He would live in a tent among the tents of his people. Then let them make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them. Exodus 25 verse 8. The tabernacle was a sign of God's presence. Now John announces that sign has given way to the reality. God himself is dwelling among us in the person of Jesus. Jesus is God making his home among us. Jesus is, as it were, God's address on earth. Whenever the Israelites pitched camp, the tabernacle was at the centre of the camp. It was a physical sign that God was among his people. Imagine a young boy walking down the road. Suddenly, he sees the school bully coming towards him. What does he feel? If he's on his own, then he feels a shiver down his spine and sweat on his brow, and for good reason. But suppose he looks over his shoulder and there's his father walking behind him. That makes all the difference. Then there is no fear. When Israel looked up and saw the tabernacle in the middle of the camp, they knew they were safe. God was with them, and he would protect them. And we too can look up and see Jesus, who walked on this earth and who works on this earth by his Spirit. God is present among us to deliver us and protect us. Or think of the moment in The Lord of the Rings when the battle for Helm's Deep looks lost. In that moment, Aragorn remembers the words of Gandalf. Look to my coming at first light on the 5th day. At dawn, look to the east. So he looks to the east, and on the brow of the hill he sees Gandalf, along with the once exiled rivers of Rohan. He sees deliverance, he sees hope. In our moments of despair, when all looks lost, we can look to the east. We can look to Jesus, and we can know that God is for us. God is among us. God will deliver us. Now let's meditate. The Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. Shepherds in the fields abiding, watching o'er your flocks by night. God with us is now residing, yonder shines the infant light. Come and worship, come and worship. Worship Christ, the newborn King. Let's pray together. O thou, whose glorious yet contracted light wrapped in night's mantle, stole into a manger. Since my dark soul and brutish is thy right, to man of all beast be not thou a stranger. Furnish and deck my soul, that thou mayest have a better lodging than a rack or grave.